everyone, welcome back to Ethical Dilemmas in CYC Stories from the Field. In this episode, we'll discuss the ethical dilemmas that can arise when working alongside other professionals in a collaborative environment. Sometimes, as CYCs, we're focused on building strong relationships with the youth, but other professionals might be more focused on treatment plans or policy adherence, which can create tension.
Yeah, and I can agree because, collaboration can sound great, it can sound great in theory, but in reality, it can get really tricky, especially when different professionals follow different ethical codes.
Yeah, and I think a big part of that comes from, the way CYCs approach care. Our work is, centered on relationships. We focus on trust, connection, and meeting young people where they're at. But then you might be working with, professionals who are more focused on policy, treatment plans, or risk management, and their approach is way more structured. So it can feel like, we're speaking two different languages sometimes.
And because of that, CYCs are sometimes seen as having a less serious role in professional settings. Like, for example, in a team meeting, if a social worker or a psychologist speaks up, their input might be taken as the official perspective. But when a CYC brings something up, especially if it's more relationship based, it could be brushed off. Yeah, that's so true.
Right. And that's what ties into power dynamics, I feel like, because a lot of the time, CYCs are the ones who spend the most time with young people, and we see their everyday struggles, we understand their emotions, and we've built trust with them. But when it comes to decision making, we're not always given the same level as authority as the other professionals in the room. And that can be really frustrating because we actually have the insights that are really crucial and important, but they might not be valued in the same way as the others.
Yeah, and that can often create tension, especially when we feel like we're advocating for a young person, but then the system is prioritizing policies over relationships. So collaboration isn't just about working together, it's also about figuring out how to navigate through those different perspectives and power imbalances while still doing what's best for the young person.
Exactly, Jamila. And it's honestly about finding that balance, respecting different professional roles, but also making sure that relational care is seen as just as important as policies and procedures. Because at the end of the day, the young people we work with don't just need services, they need connections.
So now we're going to go into our case study. A CYC is supporting a student who's been frequently leaving class. The teacher wants to enforce stricter consequences, while the CYC believes the student is overwhelmed and needs a safe space and support, not punishment.
Okay, so together let's talk about this case. We've probably all seen some version of this. You're in a school setting, working with a student who keeps leaving class. The teacher is frustrated and wants to start handing out detentions or calling home more often. But as the CYC, you've been checking in with the student and you know that they're not being defiant. They're overwhelmed, maybe dealing with stuff at home, and they leave class to regulate.
Yeah, I've literally been in that situation before as a CYC, and it's tough because you get where the teacher's coming from. They're trying to manage a classroom when it's 30 to 1, and it feels like the student's being disruptive. But from our lens, we're like, wait, this student actually maybe is trying to do something positive by removing themselves before they escalate. So that clash in interpretation becomes the ethical tension.
Yeah, Sean, the hard part about that is that sometimes teachers don't see that emotional regulation is a skill and not avoidance. Like, we're trying to support the student in managing their emotions in a safe way, but then we have the educator who might see it as skipping or disrespecting. And then it turns into this moment where you now have to decide, like, how do I advocate without creating conflict?
Right? And that's when your relationship with the student and the staff really comes into play. You can't just, go in like, you're wrong, they need support, because that obviously doesn't land well. But you can say, hey, I've noticed they tend to leave when they're feeling anxious. What if we implement a break pass system so they don't feel like they're getting in trouble every time they step out? And this way it kind of becomes more about finding a middle ground, right?
Exactly, Zara. And, it's more also about translating our perspective into something the team can hear, because when we say they need support, it might sound vague. And but if we say they've been using this coping strategy to stay regulated and regulate their emotions, I think we can build on that to help them stay in class longer as it's more collaborative.
And this is where our role as CYCs is so important. We understand the students' needs, but then we also have to help bridge the gap between them and the educator. Like if we can validate the teacher's frustration, we can also advocate for the student's emotional well-being while looking for a solution that actually works.
Yeah, because obviously at the end of the day, teachers aren't trying to be harsh. They just need consistency in their classroom. So if we can work together to create a plan that meets both of their needs, that's when collaboration really works.
Yeah, and even if the teacher still pushes for consequence, we can hold space for both of them. Like, we can help the student understand how their actions are being perceived while also making sure they're not being punished for using a coping strategy or a skill. It's all about balance.
Yeah, I agree, Hayat, because in the end, it's not about proving who's right. Rather, it's about making sure the student doesn't get lost in the middle of two approaches that aren't communicating.
Yeah, totally. And that brings us to our bigger question, right? So, how do we as CYCs advocate effectively while maintaining good working relationships with other professionals, right? So, what practices can help us make sure youth-centered care is still prioritized in these systems?
So that's a really good question, Zara. So, like in these situations, we just see how complex collaboration can be. There's a real tension between different professionals' approaches, and as CYCs, we have to navigate that while still advocating for the young people we support and work with.
Yeah, and that's why it's so important, to think about how we approach collaboration. It's not just about addressing conflicts. It's about, making sure our voices are heard in a way that actually strengthens the team. So, what does that look like in practice?
After breaking down that case study, we know that the different professionals have their own approaches, and the key is figuring out how to work together while still keeping the young person at the center of attention.
Yeah, one of the biggest things is respecting different areas of expertise while still advocating for CYC values. We might not always have the same approach as psychologists, social workers, or even teachers, but that doesn't mean our perspective isn't valid, right? So CYCs bring something unique to the table, and our relationship-based approach is essential, and we need to make sure it's recognized in a collaborative setting.
I completely agree with that, Sarah. And part of that is finding common ground because at the end of the day, we all have the same goal, which is supporting the young person in our care. So instead of focusing on the differences in our roles, it helps to really focus on shared objectives. Like, even if a therapist, for example, is more clinical treatment focused and we're more relational focused, we can still align on what's best for youth in both the short and long term.
Exactly. And that's where communication is key. Collaboration works best when we're clear, professional and solution focused. That means being direct about our observation, advocating in a way that makes sense to the team while making sure we're offering solutions and not just pointing out the problems.
Yeah, obviously, because sometimes when CYC speak up in meetings, it can feel like we're challenging authority, right? But if we frame our input in a way that's professional and grounded in what's best for the youth, it makes it harder for others to dismiss it. So instead of just saying like, this youth needs more connection, we can say, based on my time with them, I've noticed they respond best to relational approaches. So can we explore ways to integrate that into their support plan. So it's about making sure our voices are heard in a way that keeps the focus on solutions.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a good point, Sarah. At the end of the day, collaboration isn't about who's right. It's about how we can bring different perspectives together to support the young person in the best way possible. When we respect different areas of expertise, find common ground, and communicate effectively, that's when collaboration really works.
So we've talked about the challenges of collaboration, we broke down a case study, and we also discussed what makes it work. Now let's wrap up with some key takeaways. What are the most important things to remember when working alongside other professionals?
So first, I feel like respect for different expertise. So every professional brings something valuable to the table. And while CYCs focus on relationships, others might focus on treatment plans, structure, or crisis interventions, right? So the key is to advocate for our approach while also recognizing the strengths of others.
Definitely. And that ties into finding common ground. So instead of just focusing on where we disagree, it helps to highlight the shared goals between us. So whether it is a teacher, therapist, or social worker, at the end of the day, we're all trying to support the youth. And when we focus on that, collaboration becomes much easier, I feel like.
Yeah, no, totally. And another thing feel is big is communication. We need to be intentional about how we present our perspectives, right? Instead of just saying this new needs support, we can offer concrete observation and practical solution to help them. And it's about making our voices heard in a way that moves the conversation forward and not backwards.
Exactly, and that's especially important because CYCs aren't always seen as the authority in the room, right? So we have to make sure our insights are taken seriously, and the best way I feel like to do that is by framing them professionally and in a way that connects to the team's overall goals.
Yeah, I agree. And finally, collaboration isn't about proving who's right. It's about making sure the young person gets the best possible support. When we respect each other's roles, communicate effectively, and stay youth-centered in our approach, that's when the real teamwork begins.
Yeah, no, and I agree with all of you. That was a really great note to end on. Thanks for tuning into Ethical Dilemmas and CYC Stories from the Field. We really hope that this conversation gave you some insight into the realities of collaboration throughout our field. If you have any thoughts, experiences, or questions, please let us know, and we'd love to hear from you all.
Yes, and don't forget to engage with us on social media. Follow us on our Instagram at cyc.unfiltered. We post questions, polls, and interactive stories after our episode. So join the conversation and share your thoughts with us. Also, stay tuned for our upcoming quiz and reflection journal. We'll be dropping that very soon.